Good morning and welcome to the New Technology Add-on Payment Town Hall meeting for fiscal year 2015. I'd like to thank everyone traveling from near and far, for the people viewing via live stream, and for the people listening in on the phones for this event, especially the applicants that are going to be presenting this morning. We have a full agenda, and I'm going to begin by introducing our keynote speaker for this morning, who I would like to thank very much for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak to us today. He is the Director of Hospital and Ambulatory Group, Mark Hartstein.
Thank you, Celeste. Good morning. I'm Mark Hartstein. I'm the Director of the Hospital and Ambulatory Policy Group, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this morning. I'd like to welcome all of the applicants, presenters, and attendees, as well as those listening on the phone, to the 12th Annual Inpatient Prospective Payment System New Technology Town Hall meeting. We are pleased to be able to hold this meeting and hope you will find the information useful. As we indicated in the Federal Register notice announcing this meeting, the purpose of this meeting is for CMS to listen to your comments and recommendations with regard to whether technologies or services that have applied for the IPPS New Technology Add-on Payment for 2015 represent a substantial clinical improvement for the public, and to engage in a meaningful conversation about the clinical merits of each application being discussed today. Part of CMS's vision is to open our programs to full partnership with the entire healthcare community to improve the quality and efficiency in an evolving healthcare system. With respect to medical technology, we recognize that there is a constant development of new technology as well as an evolution of existing technologies that improve upon what is already available. Some of these new technologies can be very expensive. In order to reduce some of the financial barriers associated with the high costs of new technologies in hospitals under the inpatient prospective payment system, Medicare offers additional payments for innovative new technologies that are new, costly, and a substantial clinical improvement over existing technologies, so that our beneficiaries will have access to these innovative technologies that might otherwise be too expensive to be made available in the inpatient hospital setting. As both a purchaser of health care for Medicare beneficiaries and managers of the Medicare Trust Fund, we at CMS are committed to ensuring access to important medical innovations that improve the diagnosis and treatment of Medicare beneficiaries, while at the same time ensuring that this is done in a fiscally responsible manner. We believe that the additional payments we provide for the use of new technologies offers an incentive for manufacturers and developers of new technologies, including devices and drugs, to make innovative technologies available. However, we acknowledge that it is important to promote and maintain efficiency in our healthcare system, and that it is only appropriate to make additional payments for new technologies that substantially improve the diagnosis and treatment of Medicare beneficiaries. I would also like to mention that as part of our commitment to ensuring access to beneficial new technologies that improve medical care of Medicare beneficiaries, and in an effort to engage industry stakeholders in CMS activities involving new technology, CMS created the Council on Technology and Innovation to oversee the agency's cross-cutting priority on coordinating coverage, coding, and payment processes for Medicare with respect to new technologies and procedures, including new drug therapies, as well as promoting the exchange of information on new technologies between CMS and other entities. To improve the understanding of CMS's processes for coverage, coding, and payment, and how to access them, the Council on Technology and Innovation has developed the Innovator's Guide to Navigating CMS, which was originally called, I might add, the Junior Woodchuck Guide. And who is it for? Junior woodchucks. This guide outlines decision points, regulations, cycles, application deadlines, and points of contact where applicable. Our intent in creating this guide was to consolidate this information, which is already available in a variety of CMS documents and in various places on the CMS website, in a single user-friendly resource document. It is now available on our website. The Council on Technology and Innovation welcomes comments from the public and will review them for incorporation into future versions. And again, let me say I'm pleased to see the participation of all of you today here in the room and as well as on the phone. We are committed to working together with hospitals, physicians, and other providers and manufacturers of medical devices and pharmaceuticals to provide maximum access to up-to-date, high-quality health care for Medicare beneficiaries. We believe it is important to maintain an open dialogue on the issue of how technology is introduced into all of our Medicare's payment systems. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning, and I trust you will have an informative and useful meeting today. And now I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Celeste. So welcome, and please make this a productive day. I will not be able to stay the entire day, but do look forward to hearing about all of the applicants who apply for new technology add-on this year. Thank you.
I want to thank you again, Mark, for your remarks and for taking the time out of your day to be with us here this morning. Before we begin, I want to reiterate the new technology criteria. A technology must meet the following 3 conditions. Number 1, the medical or service or technology must be new. Number 2, the medical service or technology must be costly, such that the DRG rate otherwise applicable to discharges involving the medical service or technology is determined to be inadequate. And number 3, the service or technology must demonstrate a substantial clinical improvement over existing services or technology. That being said, the purpose of today's town hall is to discuss substantial clinical improvement. We posted 7 tracking forms on the CMS website for fiscal year 2015. All 7 will present today. As a reminder, written comments are due by close of business Wednesday, March 5, 2014. The public can send these written comments via email to our website email box, newtech@cms.hhs.gov, or regular mail to Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Division of Acute Care, New Technology Team. Attention, Michael Trital or Celeste Beauregard. Mail stop C40806, 7500 Security Boulevard, Baltimore, Maryland, 21244-1850. Moving on to the comments from the public agenda item. We have 2 scheduled public commenters this morning. The first is an AdvaMed representative, and the second is an individual from the Medical Device Manufacturer Association. Will the first scheduled commenter please come to the podium to read their comment? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to present our statement today. I'm Richard Price, Senior Vice President in the Payment Department at the Advanced Medical Technology Association. I'd like to submit my full statement for the record, and on this occasion, I'll simply summarize its 4 major points for this morning. I would begin by first commending CMS for approving last year 3 applications for new technology add-on payments. This is the 2nd year in a row that the agency approved 3 applications, and we hope this signals a new direction for the approval process. We note, however, that by our calculations, CMS has approved only 14 applications for new tech add-on payments since 2005, with CMS approving none or at most 1 application in several of those years. We believe that the restrictive framework for approving applications has had a chilling effect on the interest of the medical technology industry, one of this country's most innovative industries, to even submit applications for a new tech add-on payment. Our second point is that we, again, strongly support increasing the add-on payments, payment levels from 50 to 80% of the difference between the standard MSDRG payment and the cost of the procedure with the new technology. Increasing the payment percentage is one improvement that would encourage more medical technology innovation and beneficiary access to new technology. Our third point is that AdvaMed encourages CMS to make the assignment of a new ICD-10 code or FDA approval, whichever is later, the controlling date for starting the eligibility window for a new technology payment. AdvaMed recommends that the whole process of determining which to use, the FDA approval or assignment of a new code, be simplified for applicants from the outset by requiring that CMS use the later of either the assignment of a new code or FDA approval as a controlling date. And finally, we note it is critical for CMS to maintain and improve incentives for hospitals and other providers to provide beneficiary access to innovative technologies. Uncertainties in reimbursement for new medical technologies create disincentives for companies, regardless of size, to invest in research and development that lead to medical technology innovation and improvements in the quality and efficiency of health care. Small firms may be particularly vulnerable to these uncertainties because even if they have FDA approval for marketing a product, they are dependent on coverage and payment policies from programs like Medicare as well as private payers to produce revenues that will allow them to continue to innovate. These small companies are particularly critical to U.S. technology leadership because they are often the source of breakthrough technologies that drive medical technology innovation. Continued medical progress and access of Medicare beneficiaries and other patients to care that can improve their health care outcomes are at stake. And with that, I conclude, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for your public comment. Could I have the second speaker? I believe it's Medical Device Manufacturing Association.
Hi. Yes, good morning. My name is Elliot Warren, and on behalf of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association, National Trade Association based in D.C., representing hundreds of innovative medical technology companies, I'm pleased to submit the following statement for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Town Hall meeting on fiscal year 2015 applications for new medical services and technology add-on payments. MDMA's mission is to promote public health and improve patient care through accelerated access to research-driven medical technologies. We appreciate the opportunity to speak today and for the agency's willingness to hold public forums regarding important topics such as the new technology add-on payment process. Over a decade ago, Congress authorized add-on payments for new technologies in the inpatient setting. The intent was to ensure that Medicare beneficiaries had access to new technologies that otherwise would not have been utilized due to inadequate payment under the existing rates. Unfortunately, the promise of expanding beneficiary access to new technologies in the inpatient setting has not reached its potential due to the limited use of the new technology add-on payment. Over the years, a number of companies have applied for new technology add-on payments, and the overwhelming majority have not been awarded additional payments. When considering applications for new technology add-on payments, MDMA encourages CMS to refocus on the congressional intent of the authority, which is to expand beneficiary access to new technologies that demonstrate a clinical benefit, but at a higher cost. While we realize that healthcare costs are increasingly a focus for many, often investments in higher-priced therapies result in significant reductions in long-term health expenditures. The enhanced quality of life for Medicare beneficiaries must also be a priority as CMS makes its determinations. CMS must also recognize that if investment dollars are to continue to flow to breakthrough technologies, having adequate and timely payment is critical. The technologies before you today represent a diverse group of therapies that can all dramatically improve patient care. But they need adequate payment in order for Medicare beneficiaries to have appropriate access. Furthermore, if innovators are going to continue to make investments in cutting-edge technologies, the new technology add-on process must be more widely utilized. Otherwise, we will see a further contraction in investment in companies willing to take on these difficult but important projects. In closing, we appreciate CMS holding its public forum to discuss the new technology add-on payment process and appreciate the opportunity to present the views of our membership. We encourage CMS to enact policies that put patients first and give them access to cutting-edge innovations. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to ask if there are any more public comment speakers in the audience in the auditorium. If not, I'd like to ask if there are any on the phone lines that would like to give a public comment.
This is the operator. If you would like to ask a question, press pound 5 on your telephone. Pound 5 unmutes and mute your call back. Thank you.
Moderator, are there any coming in?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the commenters for their public comments. And now we'll start with the speakers. Before we begin, I'd like to start with the ground rules. Each participant is to speak for 15 minutes. Then there will be a 5-minute Q&A segment, which will include questions from the audience in the auditorium. Then I'll ask our phone moderator to open up the phone lines for any questions there. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to introduce each speaker. And the first one being presenting for Dalbavancin, Dr. Michael Dunn.
Okay. Almost ready. There we go. Perfect. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Durata Therapeutics, about our new antibiotic Dalbavancin, and the change in the treatment landscape, and how Dalbavancin will fit into improvements in that landscape. So Durata Therapeutics is a pharmaceutical company that was established in 2009. Our primary focus now is on the development of Dalbavancin, which is a new semi-synthetic glycopeptide antibiotic for treatment of MRSA infections. Dalbavancin received a Qualified Infectious Disease Product designation in 2012. Now, this is a new phenomena, and the QIDP statute was written into PDUFA 5 by Congress in order to encourage drug development against bacteria which have become resistant to existing therapies. As a consequence of this designation, Dalbavancin receives a priority review by the FDA and a fast-track status along the way. We submitted our NDA in September of 2013. Our PDUFA date is May 26th of 2014. So a little bit about Dalbavancin. Dalbavancin is an intravenous lipoglycopeptide antibiotic that's delivered, again, intravenously over a 30-minute infusion. It's a once-weekly dosing regimen that allows for the discontinuation of IV access and all of those risks associated with indwelling catheters. The profile of Dalbavancin is such that it offers bactericidal activity against the organisms of interest that cause skin infections. And in addition to a lot of work that was done in a previous NDA, Durata has sponsored 2 new phase 3 studies that focus specifically on patients with acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections. And I'll go into the details of those trials in just a minute. First, I thought it was worthwhile redefining the medical need in this area. So acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections is a new terminology that the FDA focused developers around in order to make sure that seriously ill patients with skin infections are now included in these registration trials. These are infections such as cellulitis, wound infection, and major cutaneous abscess. And all of them have to have at least 75 centimeters square of erythema. So they have to have a red area around the lesion about the size of an iPhone. The organisms that cause these infections include Staph aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes. I think you can see some pictures here taken from patients in our program of how serious these infections actually are. Abscesses of the shoulder on the left-hand side, wound infections with cellulitis on the two other pictures. Now, the unmet medical need in this area is an interesting story in and of itself. In about 2005, 2006 or so, Staph aureus, which is a major contributor to these infections, started developing resistance to methicillin. This is the MRSA organism that people may have heard about. It started first in the hospital, but rapidly spread into the community, such that now about 50% of all Staph aureus is resistant to methicillin. That's an important moment here for treatment of these skin infections, because about 2/3 of the antibiotics that we used to use to treat skin infections are now no longer active against that particular pathogen. These skin infections have to be treated empirically, so you don't get a bug first and then you check for the sensitivity and then put someone on the antibiotic. You just have to cover things right from the beginning. So it means that now, if you have a serious skin infection like the ones I just showed you, you need to use your empiric first-line therapy with something that covers MRSA. And the challenge here and the medical need that follows is that the drugs that can be used to treat these MRSA infections have some limitations. And this is where there's a need for new therapies. The most commonly used therapy for MRSA infections is vancomycin. About 75% of cases get vancomycin. 80% of that use is in the hospital, and 50% of the patients that get vancomycin get a PICC line. Now, PICC line is a peripherally inserted central catheter. It's a long catheter that gets put in through your arm and tracks all the way back down into your right ventricle. And the reason that's necessary is because it's hard to keep little catheters non-infected and useful day after day after day when you have to treat for 10 to even 21 days of therapy. That's a limitation of vancomycin. I'll show you more details of that in a second. There's also some concerns with the use of vancomycin for organisms that are less susceptible. There's some clinical failures that are occurring, even in the range where you think you should have had some success. And there's dose-limiting toxicities with vancomycin, which require drug monitoring to occur throughout the treatment interval. Another therapy that can be used for MRSA is daptomycin. That, however, has demonstrated some resistance development on therapy, as well as some side effects that require weight-based dosing. Linezolid is another drug that's used for MRSA, and while it's very potent in vitro against the organism, it has some limitations with mitochondrial toxicity, so that the duration of dosing with linezolid is limited. In addition, there are some other complications with drug interactions that require patients who are on SSRIs not be started on linezolid. That's a lot of people these days. So those are the issues that set up the medical need. We need drugs that can manage those particular limitations and still manage to treat MRSA. In addition to those drug-related limitations, there are some challenges with the drugs themselves. That 10 to 15% of cases are not successfully cured. And again, as I mentioned before, the use of a PICC line has a lot of implications to the healthcare system, not just to the patient. These lines get infected, they get clotted, they cause complications of these things, cause readmissions, a lot of peripheral visits to the doctor after you get discharged to manage complications with the PICC lines. They are a bit of a nuisance, actually. Necessary for drugs that need to be dosed every single day, but still with their own challenges. Hospital infectious diseases in general contribute significantly to admissions to the hospital. There's about 18 million patients a year that are admitted annually for infections. About 3.3 million of those have serious skin infections, acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections. That represents about 3% of all admissions, and relevant to our discussion today, about 40% of these patients are over the age of 65. Now, we're getting ready to launch our product after we finished our NDA review, and looking forward into the treatment landscape after Dalbavancin is available, we believe there's a potential for significant impact on the current standard of care of treatment of patients with these infections. There's a potential for the reduction of the length of stay because you don't need to keep people in the hospital to continue to give them their IV medicine. It's even possible to avoid the admission altogether. Certain patients are admitted with these skin infections just to get their IV antibiotics. That may not be necessary any longer for at least a significant fraction of patients. That would lead, of course, to reduction in readmission if you never get admitted in the first place, and it avoids the potential complications that could be associated with PICC lines. Moving beyond the healthcare infrastructure advantages, there's also advantages to the patient. It's simply more convenient. It allows for better compliance because you have kind of a built-in compliance situation with a drug that's only dosed once a week, and less disruptive for the patient overall. So now a little bit about Dalbavancin. So highlighted here, this is the molecular structure of dalbavancin, and highlighted in green are those new changes to the molecule which really give it its novel characteristics and make it a very unique antibiotic. At the top there you can see that there's a lipid side chain that's been added to the molecule, and that is what's responsible for this long half-life. That is a very unique characteristic of this antibiotic, and it's an innovative change to the base structure of the glycopeptide molecules that are available today. There's another in the bottom left-hand corner there. There's modifications which improve the potency over glycopeptide antibiotics by as much as a log. That's a significant change for antibiotics in general. The third area on the right-hand side of the molecule is where some variability in the homologs that make up dalbavancin overall can be found. I think this slide really summarizes the value proposition for dalbavancin overall. And I'll walk you through it in some detail. On the left-hand side is a log scale of the concentrations. This is micrograms per ml, and this is the concentrations in the blood. The bottom there is this time scale, and that's in days, not in hours. You can see that dalbavancin is dosed 1,000 milligrams on day 1. The second dose occurs on day 8 of 500 milligrams. And in the solid line there, you can see that you have serum exposures in the patient for well out to over 2 months, in fact. That dotted line at the bottom, I think that's the next slide. Is there a build on this? Yes, here we go. That dotted line in the bottom there is the level of drug you need to kill the bacteria. So you can see throughout the treatment interval, you have serum exposures, either the total drug or the free drug, which is the dotted line, which will kill off the bacteria for that long period of time. In this slide, you can see the difference between how dalbavancin is delivered and the serum exposures you see. That's the top line. And in yellow up and down there is vancomycin. That drug has to be dosed twice a day. It's intravenously administered. And you can just see, actually, from looking at this side, the inherent advantages of this new compound relative to what's existing now. First, it's very important for the patients. It's certainly going to be more convenient and simpler for them. Their satisfaction is going to go up, noting they only have to get 2 doses as opposed to 28. For the physician, they get confidence that compliance is built into this regimen. You only need 2 doses as opposed to 28 that you'd see with vancomycin. And certainly for the healthcare infrastructure at large, there's a lot of reduction in resource allocation that's going to be required to deliver only 2 drugs versus 28. So I think this slide actually summarizes a lot of the value proposition, and now you'll see how the clinical studies that were done kind of confirm the potential. There was a lot of studies done in the clinical development program. You've seen some phase 1 results there in that previous set of slides. A number of phase 2 studies helped us get confidence to move into phase 3. We've had 5 phase 3 studies that have been done. And I'm going to focus on the 2 at the bottom for the rest of the talk, actually. These are the 2 new studies that were done in acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections, study 301 and 302. To be enrolled in these studies, as I was describing earlier, you had to have either a cellulitis, an abscess, or a wound infection. You had to have at least an area of erythema the size of an iPhone, 75 centimeters squared. I can say that the average size of the lesion for patients enrolled in these programs was actually the size of an iPad, a real old school iPad. So it was pretty big actually overall. These are seriously ill patients. This is a quick schematic of the design of the study. It was a double-blind and randomized study. I'll start at the bottom there. Let me see if I can help guide you through this. Oh, it works good. So if you got randomized to vancomycin, you needed to receive 3 days of intravenous vancomycin at a minimum, and then you could switch over to oral linazolid if you met certain criteria to complete 10 to 14 days of therapy. If you were randomized to the dalbavancin arm, you got the 1 gram on day 1 and 500 milligrams on day 8. Because it's a blinded study, patients on each arm got blinded placebo to match the other regimen, and that's where all the boxes come from. The primary endpoint is actually at day 3, and I'll describe that in just a second. And we had another visit at day 14 to look at the end of treatment outcomes. We also follow people as long as 70 days because of this long half-life to make sure we understood the efficacy and safety outcomes that would occur in a drug with such a long half-life, such as dalbavancin. The primary endpoint is new. This was a new program. A lot of effort was made on the part of the FDA and the sponsors to come to some agreement about the new endpoint that we'd use for these trials. The early response is at 48 to 72 hours after therapy, and it's based on cessation of spread of the lesion. So that red area could be no bigger. Hopefully it was smaller, but it certainly couldn't be any bigger. And you had to have an absence of fever. If you met those 2 criteria, you were successfully treated per the primary endpoint. We had a number of typical secondary endpoints. It was basically the investigator says that you got cured by the end of treatment. This is a quick overview of the demographics. These are sick patients. So you see 85% of the patients enrolled had a fever at baseline, about 40% had a white count of 12,000 or greater, and a bunch of them had a left shift as well. That SIRS criteria at the bottom is basically a codified criteria for sepsis. So as much as half of the people actually enrolled in the program were actively septic. In both studies, Dalbavancin was found to be non-inferior to the comparator agent, which was vancomycin followed by linazolid. The point estimates of success for both arms were about 83% in the first study, about 77% in the second study. So in both studies, Dalbavancin met its primary endpoint. The end of treatment outcomes were similar to the primary endpoint, very similar between the two arms in both of the studies, whether we looked at the clinical evaluable or the ITT type of analysis. This is a very busy slide, so I'll just give you the messaging for this. As I was commenting, the opportunity to dose patients outside of the hospital, even with these serious infections, with the type of patients that we saw, is now possible because of the way we were delivering the compound. About 25% of the patients in the program were treated outside of the hospital walls. 75% were treated inside the hospital. That's a typical kind of issue for the Medicare reimbursement, for example, so I just wanted to point that out as well. But I think the bigger message is that whether you were treated outpatient or inpatient, you had a similar outcome, and it didn't matter whether you got Dalbavancin or the comparator agent. We always look at the outcomes based on the organisms that were identified in patients at baseline, and you can see that whether you had a Staph aureus organism, a methicillin-resistant staph, a sensitive staph, or Strep pyogenes, the outcome rates were similar on each arm at day 14. We have a very encouraging safety profile overall. One might be wondering about what kind of adverse event profile you'd see in a drug with such a long half-life. But having done this big program and now studied the drug in over 2,000 patients dosed with Dalbavancin, we're very confident that the side effect profile of Dalbavancin is at least as good, and in some areas a little bit better than the comparator agent. And that wouldn't matter if you looked at the number of patients with an adverse event, the number of drug-related adverse events, the number of physical adverse events, serious adverse events, treatment-related serious adverse events. The death rate was a little bit lower. None of these deaths were related to drug. This is just a very sick population. You'd happen to have a low death rate overall, but it was a little lower on the Dalba arm. Again, a very encouraging overall safety profile. The types of adverse events that we're seeing were kind of typical things you see in a program like this: nausea, diarrhea, and pruritus. These are the ones that are treatment-related, greater than 2%. And again, an encouraging profile for Dalbavancin relative to the comparator agent. We looked at the average standardized charge for Dalbavancin, and we noted that it does exceed the MTAP threshold. I won't go through the mechanics of that right here, but I know that's an important criteria for the MTAP process. And that leads me to my conclusions. Dalbavancin is a potent antibiotic against Staph aureus and other target pathogens, including MRSA. Efficacy was established in multiple phase 3 studies relative to the comparators. These patients were significantly ill, and the skin infection studies are very relevant to clinical practice. These are real patients that docs see every day. Dalbavancin's once-week regimen is simpler, it's more convenient, it avoids non-compliance with oral medications, and it allows for earlier discontinuation of IV access, avoiding line-related thrombosis and infection. We believe that Dalbavancin qualifies for NTAP consideration and meeting the criteria for substantial clinical improvement based on safety and efficacy advantages inherent in improved compliance and convenience, and demonstrated by the data I just showed you. Newness by virtue of its unique molecular design and its pharmacokinetics, and the cost, as the average standardized charge for Dalbavancin exceeds the NTAP threshold based on the 2012 MedPAR data. Thanks for your attention. I'll take any questions. Great.
Are there any people in the audience that have a question for Dr. Dunn? If not, I'll ask the phone moderator. Are there any questions online in queue?
If you would like to ask a question, press pound 5 on your telephone keypad. Thank you. There are no questions in the queue. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. All right, I'd like to thank Dr. Dunn very much.
Thank you.
All right, the next presenter is for MitraClip, Dr. Paul Grayburn.
Thanks. let's see if we can get this up and running here. We have a pointer. Okay, so it's my privilege and honor here to present the MitraClip data for consideration. The agenda is listed here, and I'd like to first point out that we know a lot about this disease. In 1937, in the textbook Heart Disease, Paul Dudley White described that MR, mitral regurgitation, begets MR, that there's really a vicious cycle here where you see mitral regurgitation going around and around. It increases over time, it increases load and stress on the heart. The ventricle responds to it by laying down sarcomeres in series rather than in parallel, which causes eccentric hypertrophy. There are marked mitochondrial abnormalities and loss of contractile elements in the myocytes themselves, and this just goes worse and worse and worse. In 1937, there was no heart surgery to reverse this. There was no medical therapy for it, and they learned the natural history by unfortunately watching these patients suffer and die. Now, there are two main broad classifications of mitral regurgitation. We're going to focus on the first one, which is degenerative MR, or really known as primary MR. And this is where the leaflets themselves are abnormal, most typically with prolapse or a torn cord, which causes a flail leaflet, and you can see that there in the middle two panels on the right. Functional MR, which is secondary to left ventricular dilation, is not a consideration today because the device has not really been approved for that, and that's a subject of ongoing studies. But this does address an important unmet need. This is a first-in-class transcatheter option that really allows us to do a beating heart mitral valve repair without putting the patient on a bypass machine and really without having to open the chest or the heart at all. So medical therapy is limited in these patients. It does not change the clinical course of disease. And if you look at the ACC-AHA guidelines for treating MR, it states in there that there is no medical therapy for primary mitral regurgitation. There's a significant gap here between medical therapy, which does not reduce MR, does not change the course of the disease, and does not improve mortality, and surgery, which you see on the right, which is the standard, and really the gold standard and an excellent gold standard for treating this disease. However, unfortunately, about half the patients who meet guideline criteria for mitral valve surgery in this condition don't get mitral valve surgery, typically because they're considered too risky to operate on. And those patients represent the unmet clinical need for which MitraClip fits their need. Let me remind you that mitral valve repair and not replacement is the standard for treating degenerative mitral regurgitation. This slide comes from the Mayo Clinic publication in 1995, and you can see that valve repair restores mortality to the age-predicted norm. Replacement does not. And so this is different from aortic stenosis and TAVR, where the gold standard is aortic valve replacement. In mitral valve disease, the standard is a mitral valve repair, which is really done by surgeons with expertise in that, not by all cardiac surgeons. There are multiple other studies since this that have shown the same thing. So the guidelines say, again, that mitral valve repair is recommended over mitral valve replacement in the majority of patients with severe chronic MR who require surgery, and that they should be referred to a center of excellence who does this technique. So the mitral valve clip is really based on a surgical technique known as the Alfieri stitch, or a double orifice mitral valve repair. You see on the left a suture connecting the anterior and posterior leaflets, and you see on the right the MitraClip does the same thing. At the bottom right, you see how advanced this technology is. There's a steerable guiding catheter through which a steerable clip is placed. This is a very complicated device that is very similar to robotic mitral valve surgery and very unsimilar to simply blowing up a balloon in the valve for mitral stenosis and removing it, which is really the current payment DRG for this device. This is a movie just to sort of illustrate. Let's see if it'll play. So you see mitral regurgitation is the blue jet going from the left ventricle up into the left atrium.
We puncture the femoral vein and advance a guide wire up. We cross over the the inner atrial septum from the right to the left and place this steerable delivery catheter sheath in there. Then the MitraClip comes in through this sheath, and the MitraClip is completely steerable. So both the sheath and the clip delivery system are steerable independently, which allows us to put this clip right over the mitral valve at the point where it leaks. The clip is opened, advanced into the left ventricle. This is all done under TEE guidance rather than fluoroscopic guidance. The clip is pulled back, the leaflets are captured, the clip is closed, and if there is still residual mitral regurgitation, it can be repositioned at this point. And then if the result is good, the clip can be left in place and the system removed. So here you see the removal, delivery of the clip. It's left in place over a period of about 6 weeks. It's completely scarred in and does not embolize. Now, the FDA approved this device in October of 2013. I won't read the entire language on here, but it's important to point out that this is limited to patients with primary mitral valve disease, not functional MR, and they have to be determined to be at prohibitive risk for mitral valve surgery by a heart team that includes a mitral valve surgeon of expertise. Those are really the primary essential components of this. It's very similar to the TAVR indication. The definition of prohibitive risk is on this slide, and it really requires that either there's an STS predicted operative mortality of 8% or more. This is rare. It represents about 5% of the patients in the STS database, so most patients with higher scores than this do not get operated on in America today. And then there are other things on here, porcelain aorta, severe liver disease, et cetera, that would preclude surgery. So let me show you the clinical evidence that this benefits patients. Starting out, there was a trial called Everest II. You see this in the upper left here, where MitraClip was compared to the gold standard, which is surgery. And it turns out that MitraClip is not as good as surgery at reducing MR. Surgery essentially eliminates MR. MitraClip reduces it. But it is safe, and the patients felt pretty much the same in terms of clinical benefit. During that trial, it was noticed that there were patients who could not be randomized because the surgeon said, I'm not operating on this patient if they randomize. And so as a result, FDA allowed and encouraged this Everest II high-risk registry of patients who are non-operative candidates. There were 78 patients enrolled in that. And then as that continued into a continued access program, another 273 high-risk patients were enrolled. Those 351 patients were presented at panel on March 20th, 2013. And the data is really robust because every single measurement moves in the expected direction from MR reduction. So we have MR reduction, we have reverse remodeling of the left ventricle, improved hemodynamics, including an immediate increase in forward cardiac output of 1 liter per minute on the cath lab table, improved New York Heart Association functional class, quality of life, heart failure hospitalization, and 6-minute walk test. The references for those are shown at the bottom, and the MitraClip is now included in the guidelines. The European guidelines included it in their valve guidelines that came out a couple of years ago. The American Heart Failure Guidelines that came out this fall include it, and the valve guidelines are expected any day now, and they will include MitraClip as well. So let me show you the data for which the FDA made its decision. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. There were 141 high-risk DMR patients in U.S. clinical trials. Their risk factors were reviewed by 3 physicians. Dr. Mike Mack and Pat McCarthy are very well-known mitral valve surgeons, and I also reviewed these data, and the 3 of us came down to throwing out some of these patients as not being high risk, but 127 of them definitely met the prohibitive risk criterion, and we analyzed them. You can see the mean age is 82. These are elderly patients who are really risky to undergo surgery. If you look at the other comorbidities, it's clear that these are very risky, high-risk patients, and their STS mean mortality, as you see at the bottom, was 13.2, which is really astronomically high. A typical patient undergoing a mitral valve repair has a mortality less than 1%. The 30-day mortality with the clip was 6.3, which is half what would have been predicted had these patients undergone surgery. If you look at the reduction of MR, you can see that a core lab said that 90% of them had 3 or 4 plus MR. The sites thought all of them did, but this is what happens when you have a core lab adjudicate the data, and that is a particular strength of these studies. But you can also see that at discharge, the majority of them had mild or moderate MR, and that persisted out at 1 year, so that in the surviving patients, almost 85% of them had reduction of MR to 2 plus or less. End diastolic volumes decreased substantially by more than 10%, actually about 15%, and in systolic volume didn't change much, which is what would be predicted from the known hemodynamics of this condition. New York Heart Association class improved dramatically. 87% of these patients were class 3 or 4 heart failure at the beginning, and that flipped over completely so that about 87% of them were class 1 or 2 after the clip. This is a dramatic improvement that could not be explained by a placebo effect in heart failure trials. This is the SF-36 score. It's a little bit of a busy slide, but if you look at the left, you have the physical component of this score. On the right, the mental component. The dotted line in green is the age-adjusted U.S. norm. So after MitraClip, these people approach their or exceed their age-adjusted U.S. norm, and they exceed the MCID, the minimal clinically important difference, by a substantial amount. So this confirms that they feel better in addition to the New York Heart Association class. This is maybe the most important consideration right here. If you look at hospital admissions for heart failure in the year prior to the clip versus the year after the clip, you see a 73% reduction. So these patients are not only feeling better, they're staying out of the hospital. If we look at safety, and again, the panel voted unanimously that this is a safe device. The death rate was 6.3% at 30 days in this high-risk population, and it was 23% at 1 year, again in a high-risk population, and you see the other lesser common complications here. The European data looked at 6-minute walk test. There's a 78-meter improvement in 6-minute walk test that doesn't seem to matter whether you're high risk in the middle panel or low risk on the right panel. And so if you take an 80-year-old and have them walk the length of a football field further after a clip than they could before, that's really a dramatic improvement. The same thing was seen in the European data with quality of life. This is a Minnesota Living with Heart Failure score where a decline is an improvement, and these are dramatic declines of 13 points. Just to conclude, there are a number of data in the literature from the European investigators, and the remarkable thing about this slide is that when you look at these data, the effect is consistent across studies, whether they're U.S. FDA-regulated trials or European single or multi-center studies. The reduction of MR, the LV remodeling, the patient well-being, the hospitalization reduction, all are right on top of each other. There's a very consistent effect. And so I think we can conclude that the MitraClip provides substantial clinical improvement in symptomatic DMR patients who are not going to get operated on because they're at prohibitive risk. The natural history of this untreated DMR is well established. It's terrible. Those patients, if they cannot have surgery, have an unmet need. MitraClip improves outcomes, as I have shown you, and so I think that this is a really huge advance for these patients and offers them a chance to live a decent quality of life. Thank you.
Are there any questions for the doctor in the auditorium? If not, the phone moderator, are there any questions in the queue?
If you would like to ask a question, press pound 5 on your telephone keypad. Thank you. There are no questions at this time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, doctor. Our next speaker, we're going to take a 10-minute break first. So whatever your watches say, please take a 10-minute break, and then we'll have our next third speaker, the RNS system, after break. I'm looking at like 10:15. Thank you.
Face last.
Okay,
Hold on.
Okay, we're going to get started with our next speaker. This is for the Responsive Neurostimulation Trade Brand RNS System by NeuroPace. The presenter is Dr. Martha Morell.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be representing the brain today and to give everyone kind of a sense of this device and of the size of it. In a normal head, I'm going to put my friend Liam there. So we very much appreciate the opportunity to tell you about the RNS system today. The RNS system is the first implantable responsive neurostimulator for the treatment of medically uncontrolled epilepsy. And my intent today is to introduce the technology to you, to share the clinical trial results, and to provide the information that will allow you to determine that the RNS system meets the clinical criteria for the new tech add-on. This is a therapy that provides an option for patients who have no alternative, and it is a therapy that provides a substantial benefit to a patient population who is in great need. The first criteria, of course, is newness, and this is a first-of-a-kind, entirely novel device, entirely implanted in the cranium and able to respond to the seizure focus with responsive stimulation. Because of this novelty, the cost is not reflected in the MS-DRG weights. And after 14 years of effort, we're a small startup. After 14 years, we received FDA approval not quite 3 months ago. The cost of implanting the RNS system in the hospital exceeds the CMS cost threshold, and so we want to ensure that there is not a barrier to access to care for the Medicare population. I will also show you that the RNS system provides really a desperately needed new treatment option for patients who have very little choices left. And I'll show you that it substantially improves clinical outcomes, not just seizures, but also quality of life. This is our indication for use. It is as an add-on therapy to reduce the frequency of seizures in adults who have undergone diagnostic testing at specialized epilepsy centers available in the United States to identify 1 or 2 seizure foci. These are patients who have not responded to at least 2 anti-epileptic medications and are disabled on the basis of their seizures. For those of you who are not familiar with epilepsy, you all know somebody with seizures, although you may not know it. It does affect 1% of the population. And one of the most difficult parts of living with epilepsy is that not only are seizures recurrent, but they are usually unheralded. The RNS system has been developed to treat one type of epilepsy, and that is partial onset seizures. And these are seizures that arise in one part of the brain or perhaps 2 parts of the brain and then spread. And the severity of the seizure depends on where the seizure starts and how much of the brain is ultimately involved. 30 to 40% of adults with partial onset seizures are not controlled with the over 20 available anti-epileptic medications, and an equal number have anti-epileptic medication side effects, which usually are related to cognition and to mood. And ultimately, this has an impact far beyond the disability associated with an individual seizure. 50% of people with intractable seizures are depressed. Not only is there cognitive impairment, but this tends to progress over the years as seizures continue. And the mortality risk is substantially increased, including a phenomenon, sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, which affects 1 patient per 1,000 patient years. The treatment options, as I mentioned, are limited, and I will review those. But the Institute of Medicine was convened over 2010 and 2011 and then issued a very lengthy report in 2012 on epilepsy. and ultimately concluded that new treatment options are needed, and they speak specifically to the need for device therapies. This is a schematic of the RNS system. The device is placed in a tray that is set in a full-thickness craniotomy. The neurostimulator is then seated within that tray and attached to leads containing electrodes, and those are placed at the focus for that patient's seizures. So this is individualized for each patient. The electrodes are both sensing and recording, and these are monitored by the neurostimulator 24/7. And when patterns, electrocorticographic patterns, are detected by the neurostimulator that are typical of those that precede a patient's seizures, the neurostimulator provides responsive stimulation. This goes on in the background. Patients are not aware of the stimulation, and the typical patient has a lot of epileptiform activities and may be receiving stimulation pulses of 100 millisecond, hundreds or even a couple thousand times a day, but a total stimulation delivery of 5 minutes, perhaps over 24 hours. In addition to the neurostimulator and leads, there are external components. So the neurostimulator monitors and detects and provides a responsive stimulation, but it also stores a lot of data about what's going on in the patient. This has never been available to physicians before. This communicates with a programmer that the physician uses. All of the information from the neurostimulator can be pulled onto the programmer for the physician to review, and the physician also then modifies the detection, what patterns are detected, and how stimulation is delivered according to the patient's clinical response, but also according to the data that's being recorded from the neurostimulator. Another unique feature is all of this information is then transmitted to a patient data management system. This is a secure web-based data repository. The information from an individual patient is stored there in perpetuity, so the physician can review all of the data. And the patient has a remote monitor, which allows the patient to interrogate their neurostimulator in between visits and send all of that information to the patient data management system. This allows to respond to a patient's physician to respond to a patient's concern, or just look at how the patient is doing, even when the patient is not in the office. The types of recordings that are obtained directly from the brain are really quite exciting to those of us who have been treating patients with epilepsy, because this is the window on the brain. We've never seen these types of things before. But the physician will get recordings of electrocardiogram, and in this example, there are 3 different patients who are showing the types of abnormalities that often lead into a seizure. And the physician looks at these, identifies what he or she wishes to detect, and then closes the loop so that responsive stimulation is delivered. This is then adjusted as necessary. NeuroPace began clinical trials in 2004. The first was a feasibility study in which 65 subjects were implanted and followed for 2 years. This was largely open label and for safety. We then went on with a pivotal study powered for effectiveness as well as safety, and 191 subjects followed for 2 years. And then patients were encouraged to transition into a long-term treatment study where we're obtaining another 7 years of prospective data. And so altogether, we'll have 9 years of data on safety and effectiveness, and some of our patients have actually completed their 9 years. The study design for the pivotal trial was very similar to what we were familiar with for anti-epileptic medications, with a baseline period during which patients count their seizures. Followed by implantation. Detection was turned on for everybody so that we could start recording their seizures. And then 1 month later, patients were randomized to either receive stimulation in reality or to have sham stimulation. And seizure diary data was counted towards the primary effectiveness endpoint at the end of the 2nd month through the end of the 5th month, after which all patients entered an open label evaluation period. 97% of subjects who were implanted completed the entire study. These are a very ill patient population, but not unfamiliar to those of us who work in epilepsy centers. I'll just point out they had 2 decades of uncontrolled seizures. They were taking nearly 3 anti-epileptic drugs, and they had a very wide range of seizures from 3 to 338 seizures per month. They'd tried lots of things. A third had tried the vagus nerve stimulator and it hadn't worked. 59% had had electrodes surgically implanted to see if they were candidates for an epilepsy surgery. And a third had had an epilepsy surgery, which almost always involved taking out a piece of the brain that was thought to generate the seizures, but that hadn't worked either. The seizures came from all areas of the brain. We have a very good representation of the range of epilepsies, and as we anticipate in the population outside of the trials, about a third of these patients do have Medicare, and they have Medicare on the basis of seizure-related disability. We made our primary effectiveness endpoint, which was to show a statistically significantly greater reduction in seizures in the treatment group compared to the sham, 37.9% compared to 17.3%. This actually exceeds the response that has led to approval of the majority of new anti-epileptic drugs since 1985. But we also saw another phenomenon, and that is when you do a surgery in anybody with epilepsy, they stop seizing so much for a month or 2. And we don't know whether that's the anesthesia or whether it's an inflammatory response, but we certainly saw that here, that with each month of the blinded evaluation period, the treatment group continued to get better. And the sham group, who initially had a response to the implantation, that effect wore off and they were approaching their baseline. But by the end, the reduction in the treatment group had achieved 41.5%, which is really quite extraordinary for patients who are this ill. For the 2-year follow-on, we looked at responder rate, which is commonly used in epilepsy trials. It's a percentage of patients with a 50% or greater reduction in seizures. And the observation is that this is sustained and it continues to improve over time, unlike anti-epileptic medications, which often work for 3 to 6 months and then start to lose some effect. Over the long term, we are following these patients as they go out, and this really speaks to the durability of the response. Out 4 years and 6 years. The median follow-up now is 4.5 years. The seizure reductions, median percent reduction, and the responder rates range from 50 to 65%. We also had no expectation that these patients would be seizure-free, but in fact, some of these patients experienced extended periods of seizure freedom after 20 years. And over a third had 3 months or more during which they had no seizures, and even more gratifying, 20% went at least 6 months without a single seizure. We looked at quality of life using a standard inventory that's used in epilepsy trials, and there were statistically significant improvements in quality of life at 1 and at 2 years after implant. But what was striking is some of the subcategories that are not seen in anti-epileptic drug trials, and that is improvements in memory, in language, in attention, and concentration, and also a reduction in side effects of anti-epileptic medications. Neuropsychological testing and mood inventories confirmed that there are no cognitive side effects of this therapy and no effects on mood. FDA asked us to compare our serious adverse event rate to deep brain stimulation for movement disorders and to epilepsy surgery. We demonstrated that the serious adverse event rate was not worse than those comparators. And we also established that stimulation is safe. There was no difference in types or overall numbers of adverse events between subjects in the treatment and sham group during the blinded period. And the open label safety experience was really quite favorable, and there were no unanticipated device-related serious adverse events. So the clinical trial certainly demonstrated that we were able to meet our primary safety and effectiveness endpoints. And we also showed a progressive and statistically significant reduction in seizures over years of follow-up and significant improvements in quality of life as well as quantitative measures of cognition and mood, and an analysis of the population of patients who were Medicare beneficiaries showed that they were equally likely to respond. Criteria 1 for the new technology add-on is to demonstrate that this device offers a treatment option for a patient population who are unresponsive to or ineligible for currently available treatments. And that is certainly the case. These patients had already failed anti-epileptic medications. And in fact, the average patient had tried more than 9 anti-epileptic drugs in their lifetime. Other options these patients have are the vagus nerve stimulator or to go to an epilepsy surgery for a resection of part of the cortex. But a third of them had already tried the VNS and it didn't work, and a third had already failed an epilepsy surgery. And of those who had not had an epilepsy surgery, they weren't eligible because the physicians knew that a surgery would cause functional deficits, motor paralysis, sensory problems, memory problems. The second criteria is to demonstrate that use of the device significantly improves patient outcomes compared to currently available therapies. And we know that there is, that the literature establishes that once a patient has failed 2 anti-epileptic drugs, that additional trials of medications will not yield greater success. Also, anti-epileptic drugs, because they're systemic, have a lot of side effects, and these are primarily cognitive, depression, poor coordination, and these are not side effects that we see with the RNS system or with other device therapies. And one option when you have a patient like this is you just keep adding anti-epileptic drugs on, but that substantially increases the anti-epileptic drug side effects. So another option is the vagus nerve stimulator. And when the randomized controlled trials for the VNS and for the RNS system are compared, the median % reduction in seizures in the 2 pivotal trials for VNS, EO3 and EO5, compared to our pivotal trial, show that, that we had a superior response, but that better performance particularly emerges in the 12 and 24-month open label data when the RNS system was able to achieve a % reduction of 53% by the 2nd year. The vagus nerve stimulator also has side effects. Because it stimulates the vagus nerve in the neck, it activates the recurrent laryngeal nerve. And so when the stimulation goes on, which is usually 30 seconds every 5 minutes, patients will have an alteration in their voice will get a little hoarse, they may cough, they may have a tingling sensation, a little catch in the breath. And none of these occur with the RNS system. There is no perception that treatment is being provided. And also, the RNS system was equally likely to have benefit in patients who had failed the vagus nerve stimulator as those who had never been treated with it. Resective surgery is another option, and as I mentioned, that is usually removal of the area of brain believed to be triggering the seizures. But the patients in this trial, their seizure onset zone was just too big, or it was in what we call eloquent cortex, and removing that would have left them with neurological deficits. And then frankly, some patients don't want a piece of their brain removed and are interested in interventions that are less definitive and are potentially reversible. There are also side effects or risks of epilepsy surgeries. Altogether, 3 to 10% of patients will have a neurological deficit. And after the most common epilepsy surgery, which is removal of the temporal lobe of the brain, 50% of patients will have a loss in one portion of their visual field. 30–40% will have memory problems because that's one of the functions of the temporal lobe. And about 30 to 50% will also have problems with thinking of the right word to say. We all have that problem sometimes, but when you remove the dominant temporal lobe, you have that problem all the time. So the RNS system offers advantages to resective surgery in that it's not destructive and it's reversible. And it was effective in patients who had failed or were not candidates for an epilepsy surgery. So to conclude, I think that I've made the case that medically intractable epilepsy is a devastating neurological condition. And we have many therapies, but there are still a number of patients who are not well served. The RNS system, after a very lengthy clinical program, it has been able to provide Class 1 evidence that it provides substantial clinical improvement in patients who have not responded to all available therapies or are not eligible for those therapies. The RNS system was able to substantially reduce the frequency of seizures without perception of stimulation, with excellent tolerability for the therapy over many years, and with improvements in quality of life that are substantial and also in areas that are not seen with treatment with anti-epileptic drugs and certainly with epilepsy surgery. So for those reasons, we believe that the RNS system therapy meets the substantial clinical improvement criteria. And thank you.
Is there anyone in the auditorium that has questions for the doctor? Please step up to the microphone. Thank you.
Very much for your presentation. There was a great deal of discussion at the FDA Neurologic Device Panel about NeuroPace, and particularly about the clinical outcomes potentially being different for different populations. It does appear that you have done maybe some subgroup analysis. Can you expand on that?
We did do subgroup analyses. These were pre-specified, although we were not specifically powered for these. We looked at patients whose seizures begin in the mesial temporal lobe, which is about half of adults with uncontrolled seizures, and then those whose seizures began anywhere else in the brain. And there was no difference in the likelihood of response. We also looked at patients who had and had not had epilepsy surgery and those who had and had not had treatment with vagus nerve stimulator, and there was, again, no difference in the likelihood of response.
There was a great deal of discussion about the response of those who had fewer seizures versus those who had many seizures, up to potentially several hundred per day. Have you done any analysis to sort of tease out whether the NeuroPace is beneficial for those groups?
Yes, using the pre-specified statistical analysis approach that FDA required, there is as likely to be a response in those with the lower 25% of seizures than the upper 25% of seizures. If you have specific questions about some of the discussion about alternative statistical methods FDA applied to our data, I would be very happy to answer them, but I certainly was there, and there were a number of post hoc analyses that the statisticians on our panel believed were inappropriate, that were presented by FDA, and that ultimately FDA agreed were not the right way to look at this data.
Right. We are aware of the statistical philosophies that were presented at that meeting. Have you found any specific stimulation parameters that would improve outcomes? That was a question, versus also monitoring, intracranial monitoring of the patients?
Yes, one of the challenges and one of the very exciting parts of being involved in this, of course, is this has never been done before. Everything we did is first time. And so we had a steep learning curve during our clinical trials and have now established recommended settings or program settings for detection, and then also for stimulation for the physicians who will begin using this. We also are conducting a very large post-approval study, after discussion with FDA, that will specifically look at individual stimulation parameters. But we feel that we're in a very good place now to tell physicians how to start the programming, and then after that they can make adjustments depending on their patient's response.
Thank you. Celeste, may I continue? Sure. Okay. I remember that there was a diagram that showed the response of the treatment patients and the sham patients, both in the blinded period and then I think it was up to 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. I would have expected convergence of the decrease in the frequency of seizures at some point in the next 2 years, and I don't remember seeing that.
We had 2 figures, and I realize in retrospect one was confusing and one clarified. The figure that you're referring to looked at each month from implant. And what happened is that the slope of improvement was the same for those who were in the treatment group and for those who had originally been randomized to the sham. The response actually depends on how many months of stimulation you get. So we did show another figure that showed the response based on months of stimulation, that the sham group was 5 months behind the treatment group. And if we look at just what the response is after you've received stimulation for 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, those absolutely converge and they sit on top of each other. So one of the things we learned is that with brain stimulation as opposed to anti-epileptic drugs, people continue to improve for about 2 years, after which it seems to asymptote. And this was also seen with the vagus nerve stimulator.
I'm not sure that Medicare has that data that shows that after 5 months, there's like a catch-up in the quote-unquote sham group who is now treated. Would you be willing to provide that?
No, absolutely. And also it is part of the public record because it was one of our slides shown, but it would be much easier for me to provide that to you.
That would be great. Thank you.
So in other words, if you start everybody at the same time point of having stimulation, the response is the same and the upward slope is the same.
Thank you. What do you feel is the experience level of those physicians who are part of the evaluation as well as the placement of the electrodes? Did you do any analysis on whether the electrodes were subdural or whether they were depth electrodes? Does that matter? And who do you feel that this is a community hospital treatment? Do you feel that this is an academic hospital treatment, that there has to be a certain experience? I know you guys have a course. Can you give us any information about that course?
Absolutely. And thank you for asking that. This is not a community hospital product, to start with that. The RNS system is being made available to the comprehensive epilepsy centers in the United States. There are approximately 120 of those that are adult centers. And these are centers that will know which patients are appropriate for epilepsy surgery, those who should be tried on other medications or VNS or should be candidates for the RNS system. These are the centers that routinely, daily, do this type of diagnostic testing to locate the seizure focus. And so they're staffed by epileptologists with specific training and interpretation of electrocorticograms, and also functional neurosurgeons who, as a routine course, do stereotactic implantation of depth electrodes and also placement of subdural electrodes. So none of this is outside of the skill set that's already held. So patients' centers go through a qualification process that we agreed upon with FDA that requires a specific volume and level of physician expertise, both training and experience. And then they go through an extensive training program with us that breaks down into topics what really must be understood. And this is documented that each of these trainings are completed. And in addition, we have highly skilled and trained field clinical engineers who are there in the OR with every case and will also be there with initial visits to support the physician's programming until they feel very comfortable with it.
Would you be able to share that program with CMS?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, that would be great. that would be great. Is that it, Celeste, for me? Okay, all right, thanks.
Thank you. And just to check, is there anyone on the phone that has a question for the doctor? Please press pound 5. If not, thanks very much. Thank you. Our next speaker is for CardioMEMS, Heart Failure Monitoring System, and the speaker is Philip Adamson, MD.
See if we can get the slides up. There we go. My name is Phil Adamson. I'm a heart failure cardiologist from Oklahoma City, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to talk about heart failure and a new technology that really has been described as disruptive as well as incredibly simple. I'm the principal investigator of the CHAMPION trial, which we'll talk about today. The burden of heart failure really costs both the patient and the healthcare system a tremendous amount, and most of the monetary costs of heart failure really revolve around hospitalizations. Inpatient hospitalizations for heart failure arise as a result of congestion, and over 90% of patients who are hospitalized have congestion. And the increasing incidence and prevalence of heart failure hospitalizations suggests that our current strategies to prevent such hospitalizations are lacking some piece to prevent congestion. The goals of heart failure management really rely on medical and device therapies to prevent disease progression, both with medicines like ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and cardiac resynchronization therapy devices. But another focus, and very important focus of heart failure management, is the prevention of congestion. In fact, when patients are hospitalized, the main goal of the hospitalization is to use diuretic therapy to decongest the patient, and then the immediate outpatient goals are to prevent recongestion over time. The optimization of those then proven therapies really rely on normal volume in order to maximize beta blockers and other medical therapies. This congestion process is one that has lacking technologies to prevent rehospitalization. In fact, once a patient is hospitalized, their risks for a rehospitalization in the next 6 months sometimes are up to 50%. So a large number of patients are at high risk for rehospitalization after being treated inpatient for their disease process. Now, the way we typically manage patients with heart failure is we rely on daily weights or other assessments of volume, such as biomarker assays or symptom development. And it turns out that those markers, which are standard of care currently, are used to change very important medications like diuretic therapy, which can be quite toxic if over-diuresed or under-diuresed. So when we've tested the current medical management of heart failure using daily weights or symptom development or blood pressure in the confines of a prospective randomized clinical trial, the largest of which you see here, the TELE-HF trial, the goal was to intensely monitor the things we typically tell patients to do, which is weigh yourself every day, check your blood pressure, and call us if you get sick. In 1,653 patients involved in the TELE-HF trial, in which their disease management was based on the current assessments of congestion, there was no impact on subsequent hospitalizations or mortality. Again, suggesting that our standard of care, the things we use every day and ask our patients to do in this disease process, are lacking in terms of efficacy to prevent rehospitalization. There's a lot of explanations for the outcomes of TELE-HF, but we found a physiologic basis that may be interesting to you, and that is that when one looks at the symptoms that arise from congestion, they arise as a result of increased pressures in the heart or in the cardiovascular system. So when we compared the ability of daily weights to predict filling pressures, as shown here from the COMPASS-HF trial, a previous trial of implantable hemodynamic monitoring systems, we found that a 20% increase in cardiac filling pressures was not reflected at all in a change in daily weight assessment. Gave us rise to think that daily weights were not quite sensitive or specific enough to identify patients at risk and to guide certain medications to control congestion. In fact, when one looks at the positive and negative predictive value of daily weight changes, over 91% of patients have no change in daily weights as they approach a hospitalization. So one then says, okay, let's just get a bunch of people who are really good at this, and I'm sure they can keep people out of the hospital. And so the NHLBI sponsored a heart failure consortium. Heart failure network sites then were surveyed with 463 patients that were acutely hospitalized for acutely decompensated heart failure, and asked the question, in these expert hands, can we prevent recongestion in the next 60 days? And of those 463 patients, over 2/3 of them developed significant clinically important congestion just in the 60 days following expert hospitalization. Now remember that this hospitalization was prolonged under expert hands to establish an optimal volume before the patient was discharged. And all the tools that we have currently available were utilized in expert hands to prevent recongestion, and in fact, well over 2/3 of those patients were congested by 60 days. So what's the problem? I think the problem is that we don't have the right signal, we don't have the right parameter by which we can identify changes that are meaningful in the physiology and pathophysiology of this disease, that we can monitor frequently enough and that can guide our decision-making process. So the right signal is missing that can give us the right response, an actionable signal, in order to allow us to have a rapid re-evaluation of our intervention and allow us to constantly make these patients more stable. Again, a novel technology was developed by the group in Atlanta in consortium with Georgia Tech University. A wafer-based amazing sensor was developed, which is wireless, requires no battery, is empowered by external interrogation. It's very small, which allows it to be permanently implanted in the pulmonary artery system, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Doesn't require excision and replacement of batteries or leads, and is very efficient at measuring pressures where it's placed. This small sensor is about 2 by 3 millimeters with about a 4.5 centimeter total span, and what you see in the diagram at the top are nitinol tines that allow this sensor to be safely implanted in the pulmonary artery. The diagram on the left demonstrates the selected pulmonary artery in which this device was permanently implanted. It allows it to be safely implanted without injury to the pulmonary artery or obstruction to blood flow. Once implanted, then, patients were able to go home, lie down on an antenna. That antenna then interrogated the device, empowered it, and produced a real-time pulmonary artery pressure waveform that was fully calibrated and reliable over time. This signal then was transmitted over telephone wires to a secured website in which healthcare providers could review the patient's actual filling pressures on a regular basis in order to make medical decisions and manage patients who are at high risk for subsequent hospitalization. Using this technology, then, we devised and designed a clinical trial to test the hypothesis that in addition to using what we have, daily weights and other mechanisms of establishing normal volume, we could take pressures from the pulmonary artery on a frequent basis and adjust medical therapy based on those pressures. Those pulmonary artery pressures could be remotely obtained when the patient's in their own environment at home, undergoing their activities of daily living. And unless clearly contraindicated, those pressures could be acted upon remotely with medical changes in order to theoretically develop a hypothesis that we could reduce the need for hospitalizations when basing management on pulmonary artery pressures in concert with the traditional signals. The Champion trial then was designed, and 550 patients were enrolled in the trial. This sensor is implanted during a simple right heart catheterization. So each patient underwent a right heart catheterization with hemodynamic information and sensor implantation. Once successful sensor implant was obtained, patients were randomly assigned to one of two groups, a control group in which patients were instructed to upload information from home, but that information was blocked and investigators were unable to access the hemodynamic information. Patients did not know which group they were assigned to, so it was a single-blinded, randomized, prospective controlled trial. The second group was the treatment group, in which signs and symptoms of heart failure as well as pressures were utilized to manage those patients over time. Primary safety and efficacy endpoints were evaluated at 6 months, but the design of the trial kept each patient in their original randomized group until the last patient finished 6 months follow-up. This allowed us to evaluate this strategy over a total of 17.6 months of follow-up. These patients were New York Heart Association Class 3 patients who had previously been hospitalized in the year before enrollment, representing a very high-risk group of patients for hospitalization subsequent to enrollment. Our first primary endpoint was safety. One asked the question, is it safe to embolize the pulmonary artery? And with this device, it was. This is one of the safest devices regulated by the FDA ever. The objective performance criteria shown here of 80% freedom from device or system-related complications far exceeded by our actual experience, which there was only 8 minor device or system-related complications, and usually those were associated with the right heart catheterization itself. There were no sensor failures seen during this entire time, a very safe and effective long-term sensor that allowed to be incorporated into this disease management strategy. Our primary efficacy endpoint was the reduction in hospitalizations for heart failure. And one can see that the treatment group in the 6 months of follow-up had a hospitalization rate of 0.32 hospitalizations per 6 months, and the control group 0.44, representing a 28% reduction in hospitalizations in the treatment group, highly statistically significant finding, as well as very clinically meaningful, as I'll show you in just a minute. 4 primary identified secondary endpoints were involved in the design of this trial. We asked investigators to actively treat pressures and to lower them, and that happened. In an analysis of area under the curve, pressures actually decreased in the treatment group, where they actually didn't change much at all in the control group. The number and proportion of patients hospitalized for heart failure was significantly reduced, as were the days alive outside of hospital for heart failure. And the quality of life at the end of 6 months was significantly improved in patients in the treatment group compared to control. This graphic actually represents the cumulative heart failure hospitalizations, and the first evaluation at 6 months of the primary endpoint demonstrates a 28% reduction in hospitalizations. In other words, 36 heart failure hospitalizations prevented in that group, in the treatment group. The full randomized access period, remember 17.6 months of follow-up, there were 33% reduction in hospitalizations, again representing nearly 100 hospitalizations prevented just in that 17 months period of time in this small group of patients. The days hospitalized for heart failure over the entire 17-month period was significantly reduced in patients in the treatment group. A substantial reduction in days in the hospital were seen. And to put this into clinical significance and perspective, I want to really allow you to focus on this slide, because what you see here are all of our standard of care medical therapies and device therapies for heart failure. The trial, the duration, the annualized reduction in heart failure hospitalizations, and importantly, the number needed to treat to prevent one hospitalization for heart failure. And you can see that this strategy, which incorporates all of the other strategies listed in this slide, really only needed 4 patients to be treated to prevent one hospitalization for heart failure. To further expound on the novelty and the amazing clinical effect of this strategy, one can look at the number of hospitalizations prevented per year when 100 patients were treated to kind of increase that to a global perspective. And again, there were 23 hospitalizations prevented per year for every 100 patients treated in this trial. Now, this was not at a cost shifting. This was not at an expense of an increase in other kinds of hospitalizations. In fact, all-cause hospitalizations were also reduced in the treatment arm in the 17.6-month follow-up, a highly statistically significant and, again, clinically meaningful result of decrease in all-cause hospitalizations was seen in concert with the heart failure-related hospitalization reduction. One of the most important metrics in heart failure trials over time has been a combination of heart failure hospitalizations or all-cause hospitalizations with mortality. And one can see when this analysis was applied to the CHAMPION trial, not only were heart failure hospitalizations reduced, but all-cause hospitalizations and death, shown in the green bar, were reduced. Again, 29 events prevented per year per 100 patients treated. So in conclusion, after this trial, we concluded that this is very novel technology that enhances the management of heart failure patients' desperate need for a new strategy to prevent hospitalizations in this epidemic. This significant clinical improvement in Class 3 patients with a prior hospitalization improved quality of life and reduce the need for in-hospital care. Thank you very much for your attention.
Are there any questions in the auditorium for the doctor? Are there any questions on the phone line? If there are, please #5 to unmute your phone. If not, thank you very much. Thank you, doctor. Our next presenter is for Watchman left atrial appendage closure technology, and the presenter is Dr. Kenneth Stein.
Great, thank you and good morning. I'm Ken Stein. I'm Chief Medical Officer for Cardiac Rhythm Management at Boston Scientific. I want to thank CMS and giving us the opportunity to comment on our application for a new tech add-on payment for the Watchman left atrial appendage closure device. Watchman is designed to offer an alternative to prevent thromboembolism in select high-risk patients with non-valvular atrial fibrillation. And we believe this novel technology meets the criteria for an add-on payment. I'll begin by reviewing the need for a new solution for stroke prevention in atrial fibrillation. If I can hit the right button. As you all know, atrial fibrillation-related stroke is a major public health problem. Patients with atrial fibrillation have an increased risk of stroke of 4 to 5 times, and strokes in these patients result in greater disability and higher mortality compared to non-AF-related stroke. The standard of care for decades has been treatment with a systemic anticoagulant, such as warfarin and now the novel oral anticoagulants. These are all good options for many patients with AF, but not for all, because by definition, systemic anticoagulants increase the risk of bleeding, including, most importantly, intracerebral hemorrhage. And as a result, contemporary data from Medicare database show that despite the availability of these anticoagulant treatments, roughly half of high-risk AF patients remain untreated. And there is thus a critical need for a novel therapy option for these patients who are otherwise unprotected from stroke or systemic embolism. It's generally accepted that the majority of embolic strokes in AF patients result from a blood clot that originated within the left atrial appendage. And Watchman works to prevent strokes by permanently sealing the opening of the left atrial appendage, trapping potential emboli, and preventing them from migrating to the brain or to other vital organs. The Watchman left atrial appendage closure device meets the criteria for consideration of additional add-on payment for newness, for cost considerations, and for substantial clinical improvement. We anticipate this first-of-its-kind device to be approved for sale in the United States in the first half of this year, based on the FDA panel held last December, with 13-to-1 votes in favor of safety, in favor of efficacy, and in favor of benefit risk. This new technology meets the cost criteria as detailed in the two analyses that we included in our application, and I won't discuss those. I'll spend the rest of the time reviewing the key highlights of our clinical evidence portfolio that support the substantial clinical improvement with Watchman. As an overview of what we'll review, there are 3 trials that contribute to the majority of evidence on the Watchman device. The studies all defined a composite measure of stroke, systemic embolism, and cardiovascular or unexplained death to determine efficacy. The first randomized controlled trial, PROTECT-AF, demonstrated non-inferiority to warfarin for primary efficacy as early as 900 patient years of follow-up. Now, in long-term follow-up of 2,621 patient years, Watchman shows superiority over warfarin, with a 40% relative reduction in total events. In addition, Watchman patients had a significant 60% relative reduction in cardiovascular mortality and a 34% reduction in total mortality as compared to patients on long-term warfarin. The CAP registry supplements these findings with over 1,300 patient years of follow-up and efficacy rates consistent with the long-term PROTECT results. The most recent randomized trial, PREVAIL, met one of its 2 efficacy endpoints, despite, at this time, representing a relatively short follow-up period of only 400 patient years. Now, as with any invasive procedure, there are acute risks assumed up front for delayed benefits. PROTECT showed that most of the safety events with Watchman occurred periprocedurally, and that long-term safety was comparable with the use of warfarin. The Watchman safety profile improved when refinements were made to training and procedural technique, and importantly, the PREVAIL trial demonstrated an improved safety profile and that new operators could be trained to implant the device as safely and as effectively as experienced operators. Thus, the totality of evidence demonstrates that Watchman's safety and efficacy as compared to warfarin for prevention of stroke, systemic embolism, and cardiovascular death is non-inferior and in fact superior with long-term follow-up, representing a substantial clinical improvement, particularly for those patients who are unable or who are unwilling to take long-term warfarin. We'll review with you the detailed data showing that Watchman improves clinical outcomes by reducing cardiovascular mortality, avoiding bleeding complications like hemorrhagic stroke, and preventing disabling strokes as compared to long-term warfarin. Beyond being a safe and effective alternative to warfarin, permanent closure of the left atrial appendage is designed to remove the need for long-term anticoagulation therapy. And in fact, between 93 and 99% of Watchman patients are able to discontinue warfarin within a year following implant. Watchman thus offers a necessary treatment option for high-risk AF patients who are eligible for warfarin but who need an alternative. Watchman has been studied in nearly 2,000 patients with over 4,900 patient years of follow-up in clinical trials. In addition, Watchman is already approved in more than 55 countries worldwide, totaling 5,000 commercial implants to date. Key demographics from the trials show a primarily older male population. The CHADS scoring system was used to assess stroke risk in the study patients and provide guidelines for the use or eligibility for oral anticoagulants. A patient's total score predicts their annual risk of stroke. And the CHADS VASC score was developed to supplement the CHAD score after the initiation of the trials and incorporates additional risk factors. Using these two scores, CHADS or CHADS-VASC, 93 to 100% of the patients in these three clinical trials were at high risk for stroke. Let me now review the key efficacy results, demonstrating that Watchman long-term has a substantial clinical benefit over conventional systemic anticoagulants. We used a Bayesian statistical model for PROTECT-AF and for PREVAIL. Using that model by 900 patient years of follow-up, PROTECT already demonstrated that Watchman was non-inferior to warfarin. But as I said, with continued follow-up, now out to 2,621 patient years of total follow-up, the Watchman arm demonstrates superiority for primary efficacy, with a 40% relative reduction in events versus warfarin. And that has a posterior probability of superiority of 96%. The elements of the primary efficacy endpoint are also shown here. And although the study was not powered to demonstrate non-inferiority for any of the individual components, the reduction in total strokes of 32% did meet this criterion. And the reductions in particular in hemorrhagic stroke and cardiovascular mortality of 85% and 60% respectively met criteria for superiority as compared to warfarin. This slide shows the Kaplan-Meier curves for primary efficacy. The yellow line indicates the control group, showing a relatively constant event rate over time. In contrast, what you see as you look at the Watchman curve, that there's an initially higher rate of events due to periprocedural complications. But over the long term, the subsequent event rate is lower than in the control. And as a result, the long-term curves diverge such that the Watchman group eventually performs significantly better, demonstrating that statistically significant 40% relative reduction in events. Using that previous graph as a reference, here's the composite efficacy rate in the CAP Continued Access to Protect registry in red. And as you can see, the outcomes in CAP were slightly better than in the device arm of PROTECT, despite enrolling a slightly higher risk population. In PREVAIL, the second randomized trial, event rates were nearly identical in both groups, with a rate ratio between the groups of 1.07. But with the small number of patients and the short follow-up to date, the credible interval was wide, with an upper bound of 1.89 that did not meet the pre-specified non-inferiority criterion. However, the posterior probability of non-inferiority was still almost 96%. PREVAIL had a second primary endpoint designed to isolate the mechanism of action of the device, a composite of ischemic stroke or systemic embolism, excluding events within the first 7 days following randomization. The rate difference was 0.0053 with an upper credible interval of 0.0273. This did meet the endpoint for non-inferiority with a posterior probability of non-inferiority of 98%. Overall, the number of events in each group is low, and as I said, for PREVAIL, the data only represent approximately 400 patient years and 1 year of follow-up data. The data in totality from PROTECT, CAP, and PREVAIL consistently support efficacy for long-term reduction of stroke and systemic embolism. Now I'll turn to the safety results demonstrated over the course of the clinical trials. As with most new interventional therapies, there were early complications associated with the learning curve of new operators, and that was seen in the first half of the PROTECT trial. This prompted an evaluation and a change in the way we trained operators, in implant techniques, and some of the components of the device itself. And to isolate the effects of these changes, PREVAIL was designed and was run using a specific safety primary endpoint limited to procedure-related death, ischemic stroke, and systemic embolism, or other events requiring surgical intervention or major endovascular repair within 7 days post-procedure. And based on this endpoint definition, there were a total of 6 events. So with an event rate of 2.23% an upper credible interval of 2.65%, PREVAIL did meet its primary safety endpoint. In addition to PREVAIL's unique 7-day safety definition, we evaluated a consistent and more inclusive definition of safety events post hoc to enable comparisons across the suite of trials. And as you can see, when we compare the first half of enrollment in PROTECT to the subsequent trials, the procedural risk has been reduced by more than half, from 9.9% in early PROTECT to 4.2% in the PREVAIL trial. PREVAIL had an additional requirement to include new operators as part of the safety evaluation, and the reduction in safety events that you see was obtained even with 40% of procedures in PREVAIL performed by new operators. These data demonstrate, then, that the safety profile of the Watchman implant is within acceptable limits, both for new and experienced operators. Finally, let's look at some other substantial clinical benefits to the Watchman implant. Though the device itself doesn't prevent bleeding, an expected outcome of removing the need for long-term anticoagulation in up to 99% of patients is that severe bleeding events should also decrease. The 32% reduction in all strokes in the Watchman arm was primarily driven by the large reduction in intracerebral hemorrhage in the Watchman arm. Hemorrhagic strokes are the most dreaded bleeding complication of anticoagulant therapy. And recall that in PROTECT, there was a significant 85% reduction in hemorrhagic strokes with Watchman. Hemorrhagic strokes are generally much more disabling than the typical ischemic stroke. And in anticoagulated patients, these strokes are almost always catastrophic. Including all types of stroke, there was an impressive 63% reduction in disabling strokes in the Watchman-treated patients compared to those treatments treated with warfarin in the randomized trial, with a posterior probability of superiority for Watchman of 98%. Finally, as illustrated in these Kaplan-Meier curves from PROTECT, all-cause mortality in the Watchman group tended to be better than in the control group. The rate ratio of 0.66 favors Watchman. The posterior probability of superiority for total mortality was 94%. In conclusion, we'd like to ask you for your consideration for a new tech add-on payment for the Watchman left atrial appendage closure device to prevent thromboembolism in warfarin-eligible patients with non-valvular AF. We believe that Watchman meets the newness, the cost, and the substantial clinical improvement criteria as demonstrated by the totality of evidence presented in our application and reviewed today. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Are there any questions in the audience for the doctor in the auditorium? If not, are there any questions on the phone line? Please #5 to unmute your phone. If not, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. Our next speaker for Serelaxin is Dr. Greenberg.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce myself. I'm Barry Greenberg. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Diego. I'm director of the Advanced Heart Failure Treatment Program there. I've spent the majority of my career working in heart failure, both in a clinical sense, seeing patients, and also doing research, both basic in the laboratory and clinical research, including involvement in clinical trials. I've been involved in national organizations in heart failure, including as president of the Heart Failure Society of America from 2006 through 2008. I am involved in the clinical trial that I'll be presenting the data from today, the RELAX-AHF study, serving on the executive committee as a consultant of Novartis. I also, my travel here was paid today by Novartis, and I am a consultant for that company. So those are my disclosures also. So heart failure, Dr. Adamson has already given us a very nice introduction to this, is a growing and a very important public health problem in the United States associated with a high mortality rate. It affects over 5 million Americans, and that number is going to increase substantially, in large part based on the aging of the American population. This is true not only in the United States, but throughout virtually all industrialized countries. Heart failure ends up putting more elderly people in the hospital than any other cause, and it's one of the top 3 causes for billings to Medicare in the United States. The overall costs are estimated to be very close to $25 billion in direct medical costs, and with the increase in the heart failure population, there'll be a commensurate increase in total costs attributable to heart failure. What is probably less well recognized is the substantial mortality rate associated with heart failure, and the mortality rate is comparable to that seen to breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers. For those individuals who are hospitalized for heart failure, this represents a watershed event, as I'll describe in just a few moments. Mortality is substantial, with 1 out of 3 of these patients likely to die in the year after a heart failure hospitalization. What's been remarkable is that over the past decade, despite substantial improvements in the management of chronic heart failure, this risk for mortality after a heart failure hospitalization has changed not at all. Now, what is heart failure? It's a medical condition involving abnormalities in the pump function of the heart, such that adequate amounts of oxygenated blood is not delivered to the functioning tissue throughout the body. It's associated with a buildup of blood within the heart and the vascular system that leads to the signs and symptoms of congestion that I'll describe in just a moment. In response to the abnormalities in heart function, structural changes take place within the heart, which becomes enlarged and baggy. The symptoms that are associated with heart failure are substantial, and patients begin to develop inabilities to perform the usual functions associated with their daily lives, or are able to do this only in a greatly impaired manner. These symptoms of heart failure are outlined on this slide. They include abnormalities in breathing. Patients feel short of breath initially during exercise. This may progress to shortness of breath at rest and may awaken patients at night and cause them to sleep in an upright manner, or even in advanced cases not to sleep at all. Weakness and fatigue are very common, and due to the congestion, swelling of organs of the periphery, such that there's ankle edema, swelling in the abdomen, and so on, also occurs in this patient population. When patients are hospitalized for heart failure, when they experience an episode of decompensation that require them to come into the hospital, I mentioned that this is a watershed event, and the reason for this is that it represents a change in the clinical course, because it's followed by subsequent hospitalizations in many of these patients, and also a substantially higher risk for mortality. That's outlined on the slide over here, showing the decline that takes place after a heart failure hospitalization and the increase in events and the worsening of the overall clinical course that's characteristics of patients following a heart failure hospitalization. Now, once patients are hospitalized, the clinical course is not always straightforward. Patients are given intensive therapy. Often they're treated in the intensive care unit, and surveillance of these patients is quite high. Regardless of this, 15 to 30% of these patients, even once they're hospitalized, experience a further worsening of their clinical course. This is defined as an abrupt and serious change in their clinical status and is associated with an intensification of therapy in the hospital. The importance of this is that it is associated with a prolongation of the hospital stay, and it's also been recognized now as a marker for an increased risk of subsequent mortality. The therapies for treating decompensation, for hospitalizations for heart failure, include the use of diuretic agents, vasodilator drugs, and inotropes. All of these have been associated with an improvement in symptoms during the hospitalization. However, none of these have been associated with a reduction in worsening heart failure or a prolongation in survival. Moreover, over the past several years, there have been several clinical trials looking at new approaches and strategies, and none of these have been shown to impact on either worsening heart failure or prolongation of survival. So the field in this area has been quite static. However, there is some hope, and I will be presenting a summary of the data for serelaxin that was recently studied in a large-scale clinical trial called the RELAX-AHF study. When the data from this study was released, it was picked up in a variety of publications. This slide just summarizes some of the commentary made on the release of the data from the RELAX-AHF study, indicating optimism that this would meet a substantial unmet need in the management of this patient population. So the development of serelaxin has been going on for some time now, and the RELAX study, which I'll summarize in subsequent slides, was based in large part on a pilot study called PRE-RELAX, which began in 2007. This was a dose-finding study that gave us important signals about the efficacy of serelaxin in the patients with acute decompensated heart failure. RELAX-AHF was initiated in 2009 and completed in 2012. The results were revealed in 2013, and this led to a BLA in early 2013, and the current development is continuing to ongo with a second study, RELAX-AHF 2, which also seeks to confirm some of the mortality findings that were shown in RELAX-AHF. Now, this is a diagram of the endpoints that were looked at in RELAX-AHF. And let me mention that these are all patients who have decompensated heart failure and have been hospitalized. They're treated with standard therapy and then randomly assigned to receive serelaxin in a 48-hour continuous infusion or placebo on top of their standard therapy. So the drug is given for a 48-hour period after the arrival of the patient to the hospital. The primary endpoints were relief of symptoms, relief of the symptoms of discomfort with breathing, evaluated in two ways, either through the visual analog scale or the Likert scale, and the criteria for a positive study are shown on this slide. These were looked at up to 5 days after the initiation of the hospitalization. Worsening heart failure, which I've already described, was looked at various time points extending out to 14 days after hospitalization. And in addition, the length of stay was another designated endpoint that was looked at following the index hospitalization. Additional endpoints that were evaluated in this study included the days alive and out of the hospital, cardiovascular deaths, and cardiovascular deaths extending out to 180 days following the index hospitalization. So the study met its goal for achieving relief of symptoms in the initial period. This is data from the visual analog scale showing a highly significant reduction in symptomatic dyspnea reported by patients over the first 5 days of hospitalization. This was driven in large part by a reduction in worsening heart failure. This slide outlines worsening heart failure over the first 5 days in patients treated with placebo, shown in the gray bars, compared to those individuals who were treated with serelaxin. And one can see, starting initially at the 6-hour time point and extending throughout the 5-day period, a reduction in the cumulative percentage of patients who experienced worsening heart failure. Overall, there was a 47% risk reduction in worsening heart failure during this time period, favoring serelaxin compared to standard therapy alone. This was highly significant in favor of this drug. Now, one of the areas that has emerged in the management of this patient population is recognition that during the hospitalization, patients are vulnerable to damage to vital organs, and that one can detect this by looking at biomarkers during this time period. In addition, elevations in these biomarkers are also used as indicators of subsequent risk. And what was seen in the RELAX-AHF study was that serelaxin had a favorable effect on these biomarkers. Specifically, if one looks at troponin T, a biomarker for damage to cardiac myocytes, damage to the myocardium, there's a significant difference compared to the individuals who were treated with standard therapy alone. A greater reduction, a more rapid reduction in the serelaxin-treated patients, suggesting that this drug may prevent loss of cardiac myocytes. Looking over at the kidney, cystatin C, a marker of kidney injury, showed a pattern of a protective effect of serelaxin, which was manifest out to 60 days after discharge from the hospital. This suggests that the drug may prevent a loss in renal function that's sustained even well past the hospitalization. The other key biomarker that was looked at was a natriuretic peptide, N-terminal proBNP. This is a marker of an increase in wall stress and a measure of congestion within the heart. Here, what was seen was that serelaxin led to a more rapid and more substantial reduction in this biomarker early in the clinical course, suggesting that the drug may alleviate stress and decongestion in the myocardium. All of these changes have been shown to be predictive of outcome in acute heart failure patients. Now, what was particularly interesting was that this was accomplished with a reduction in the use of loop diuretics, which are the standard drugs which are used to treat these patients when they're admitted to the hospital with decompensated heart failure. This slide points out the 24% reduction in the use of these loop diuretics in the patients who were treated with serelaxin in the RELAX-AHF study. And the slide over to the left shows that this is accomplished over a relatively short period of time, and that there's a faster discontinuation of intravenous diuretic doses with serelaxin. What that adds up to is a reduction in the total time of hospitalization of nearly 1 day in serelaxin-treated patients. This was also associated with a significant reduction in the amount of time spent in the intensive care unit. An important outcome that was seen in this study was the impact of serelaxin on both cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Patients were treated for only a 48-hour period during the hospitalization. The data that's shown here extends out to 180 days and points out the reduction in all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. In each case, this reduction was in the range of 37%, and each case significantly favorable for serelaxin compared to standard therapy alone. The side effect profile of the drug was also quite favorable. It's outlined on this slide, and the number of patients with serious adverse effects was only minimally greater than in the placebo study. And in general, this is a highly favorable side effect profile for an agent in this patient population. So to summarize, serelaxin was associated with a significant clinical improvement in patients who were hospitalized with acute heart failure. Specifically, there was a 19.4% improvement in dyspnea, or shortness of breath, the predominant symptom which led patients to be hospitalized with decompensated heart failure. This was driven largely by close to a 50% reduction in the rate of worsening heart failure, which is seen in a substantial number of patients despite being hospitalized and getting intensive therapy. There was a reduction in the biomarkers that were indicative of organ damage, suggesting protection of the heart and other vital organs during this highly vulnerable period when patients are admitted with decompensated heart failure. There was a significant reduction in the hospital length of stay, which could potentially lower the cost burden of heart failure. And long-term, there was a 37% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. That was accomplished with a similar adverse event profile indicating the safety of this drug in the milieu of acute decompensated heart failure. So thank you for your attention.
Do we have any questions in the audience for the doctor? Yes. Please step up to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jim Rollins. I'm with CMS. I did review the packet sent to us, which included the two studies. The RELAX-AHF study, as you said, at 180 days, it did reveal a reduction of all-cause cardiac mortality. But at 60 days or 30 days, there was no reduction. And if you take a look at the 180-day analysis, it was a post hoc analysis. A post hoc analysis. Are you planning on doing another study using another statistical technique as opposed to post hoc analysis to confirm that there's decreased mortality at 180 days or days prior to that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Let me mention that this study was not powered, nor was the primary endpoint mortality. Cardiovascular mortality and all-cause mortality, however, were pre-specified endpoints, and cardiovascular mortality was part of the pre-specified secondary endpoints. Nonetheless, there is a second study that is currently going on now. It's begun. It's starting in the United States and also in Europe, called RELAX-AHF-2. This is specifically designed to assess the impact on mortality.
Second question. Some of the patients in the study who dropped out during the study were not included in the final analysis. So is an intent to treat analysis also going to be a part of the study, the second study that you're going to be doing?
Yes, an intent to treat analysis, I believe, was also performed on the RELAX-AHF study. It certainly will be performed on RELAX-AHF-2.
Thank you.
Anyone else in the audience? If not, if there's anyone on the phone, please pound 5 to unmute for your question. Doesn't sound like anyone's there. All right. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your time. And our last speakers, last but not least, is for HeliFix Endo Anchor System. There are going to be 3 presenters. It's a 15-minute time frame, so they're going to do 5 minutes apiece, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A at the end. First presenter is Dr. Kenneth Ori. Second presenter is Dr. William Jordan, and third presenter is Melissa Martinson, PhD. Sure. And he's going to help you plug it in. Okay.
Plugged up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Kenneth Oriel. I'm a vascular surgeon by training, former chief of surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, and I am the president of Syntactics, which is a contract research organization that has been involved with the device that you're going to hear about today. So, I'm not sure which slide I'm controlling here. So maybe you can come back out. I don't think it's this computer.
You don't think it's connected?
All right. Maybe we could switch the slides over to the laptop from the computer that you have.
Do this and see.
That looks good, because that's now this one.
Okay, there you go.
Great. Thank you. Well, we're going to talk about endovascular aneurysm repair, and we're going to talk about some unmet clinical needs. 3 things in particular. First, the importance of a stable proximal seal, and we'll understand in a little bit what that is for those of you who don't do these repairs or are otherwise unfamiliar. We're going to talk about this particular device, the HeliFix Endo Anchor System, and we'll talk about how HeliFix is actually an alternative to standard surgical sutures, which have been used for aneurysm repair actually for about 70 years. So here is an example of a couple of aneurysms. If you look over here, this is the aorta. Here's an infrarenal abdominal aortic aneurysm, most common type, and then the second is a thoracic aortic aneurysm in the chest. And here's the standard technique of repair. Basically, clamp the artery, take a surgical graft, and sew it in place with standard sutures. And it works very well, but as you might guess, it's sometimes difficult for an old or frail patient to undergo this procedure. So endovascular aneurysm repair was actually started in 1991 by Juan Perotti, and this offers a less invasive approach. Sounds very good, but unfortunately it has some problems, and we'll get into that. But let's look first at what's been going on over the last 15 or 20 years. Since 1995, the rate of aneurysm repair has stayed relatively constant. It's gone up a little bit. But look what's happened with open surgery versus endovascular repair. Open surgery has dropped from about 25,000 per year, these are Medicare numbers, down to as low as just over 7,000 per year. And by contrast, endovascular repair has increased so that now about 80% of cases done in patients over the age of 65 are done with this minimally invasive approach. But there are problems. And as you might guess, the problems are where these grafts attach to the aorta. And here's an example of one of the most common problems. It's called a type 1 endoleak. And what happens here is that the blood flow, which should be going through the graft, also goes into the aneurysm sac. The sac is not depressurized, and the aneurysm can still rupture. And the thing that we'll talk about is this location of the aorta called the neck. That's a very critical spot, and it's a very difficult spot for endovascular grafts to attach to. There are a variety of neck shapes and configurations that are associated with problems. Short necks, large necks, necks shaped like funnels or a conical shape, and very angulated necks. These are all necks where it's very difficult for an endograft to attach. And as you can see in this slide, blood can escape around the graft. As well, the graft can be dislodged or migrate. And again, the patient is then no longer protected from rupture. Here's an angiogram of an endoleak. You can see this, this contrast pouching out just to the patient's right side, our left side, and that's a type 1A endoleak. Exactly what the Helifix device is designed to address. There are a few trials, randomized trials of abdominal aortic aneurysm repair. These are two of them, EVAR1 and DREAM, and in both cases, endovascular is not as durable as we would like. It's not as durable as open surgery. Open surgery, remember, is the procedure where the graft is sutured with stitches to the aorta. And when you have problems, then they require secondary procedures. So we find these problems with CT scans or ultrasound, and then secondary interventions are required, which are associated with more discomfort for the patient, but also added cost. In this slide, over $30,000 to take care of these secondary procedures. And when they occur, they don't just occur singly, they occur in pairs or triples. One endovascular secondary procedure begets another one. So here is the Helifix device, not pictured here, but rather these are the devices that it is used in, and these are the standard endovascular grafts that are marketed today in the United States. Well, I talked a lot about suturing, and this is the founder, if you will, of suturing blood vessels. It's Alexis Carrel, who won the Nobel Prize about 100 years ago for suturing blood vessels, and it works very well. The endoanchor pictured here is an analog to open suturing techniques. It's a helically shaped device which can be placed through an endovascular or minimally invasive approach. Here it is in a cadaver aorta. You can see some of these going to the most important part of the aorta, the adventitia. So here we have a surgically sutured graft, and next to it a graft, or actually what you can see there is the endoanchors in the aorta itself, mimicking what we've known has worked for over 100 years. Now, here's a cadaver study, and I will just direct your attention to one point. This is the strength of a hand-sewn anastomosis, but look here, no matter what graft one uses, what endograft, when you put endoanchors in, In blue, you increase the strength of that connection. And in fact, you increase the strength to something even greater than the surgically sewn anastomosis. Here is an example of endoanchors on an X-ray, and you can see how they're placed through this sheath. And here they are positioned all the way around the endograft, similar to a surgically sutured anastomosis. So I want to leave you with just one thought before I turn this over to Dr. William Jordan, and that thought is that endovascular aneurysm repair, although great for patients, still has some limitations. The limitations are related to the proximal neck, and endoanchors are designed to surgically, or if you will, be an analog to a surgically sewn anastomosis, so we can get the same kinds of results that we've been used to with open surgery, although still with a minimally invasive technique. I'll now turn the podium over to Dr. William Jordan from UAB. Will.
Thank you, Dr. Oriole, for those introductory remarks. Now, as a practicing vascular surgeon at University of Alabama, I want to take you through some of the clinical data that's available, and these are studies that I've been a participant and also a principal investigator. So the Staple 2 study was the initial IDE study that identified there were excellent proximal neck results when treating these patients with the endoanchors, particularly in hostile neck anatomy. Since that study, the anchor registry now has been tracking real-world results after these anchors have been available to be used by the general medical population in the real-world setting. Now, I will not touch on the final comment here. That please note that over 2,000 patients have already received this device and used the clinical benefit. First, the Staple 2 study. It had very good outcomes for short necks. Overall, the study had excellent primary safety results at 30 days and effectiveness at 1 year. But specifically, I want to draw your attention to this 27% of patients who had short proximal necks that were less than 15 millimeters in length, thus a concern for early and even a late failure. When we compare the Staple 2 IDE study to other commercially available grafts that went through their IDE study, we can identify that even though these necks were shorter, they had an excellent result specifically associated with the type 1 endoleak rate that was only 7% in the Staple 2 study compared to the other ranges that were up to 4%. When we also look at another surrogate endpoint, or what the ultimate result, and we could see sac shrinkage in patients after they were treated with an endograft, the Staple 2 study identified over 80% of these patients had sac shrinkage compared to the other IDE studies that had a lower range. So in summary, Staple 2 had better results with sac regression, also had better results with early and late type 1 endoleaks, appeared to be a superior graft, and particularly related to this proximal fixation. So the conclusions were that in this study there were no type 1 endoleaks out to 3 years of follow-up so far. There have been no endograft migration when the anchor penetrates all the way through the adventitia, the full thickness of the aorta, and it has the highest reported rate of aneurysm sac regression after treatment. So since release of the anchor, we now use this in a commercial setting. We use it in our own practices, and that's when the anchor post-market registry became available as a prospective observational international dual-arm registry to look at both primary treatment and revision treatment for endovascular aneurysm. Since the initiation of this study, there have been over 340 patients who are now enrolled through the end of January, with the anticipation of 1,000 in each arm for a total of 2,000 patients. When we look at those 344 patients, we identify that 3/4 of the time these are used in the primary setting, 1/4 in a revision setting. So 76% are done at the initial endovascular aneurysm repair, and 1 in 4 of these patients come back at a later setting to remediate some problem. We also analyze the anatomic characteristics of those patients who were treated. Specifically, you can see the diameter of the aorta is well over 5.5 centimeters in this series. And while the neck length average ranges 15 to 16 millimeters, we identify that almost half of these patients had very short necks, less than 10 millimeters. It's identified in this line right here. These patients had hostile neck anatomy, and that's where it's being used in the real-world setting. We also asked each investigator why they were using these anchors in their particular setting. And in the primary setting, they were used primarily for concern about late failure, whether it be neck dilatation or potential migration but also almost 23% of the patients had utilization because of treatment of an acute type 1 endoleak in the primary setting. The revision arm was used for some combination of an endoleak or graft migration, which indicates some late failure. The acute technical results are listed here from the Anchor Registry, and that is that almost 99% of the patients treated in the primary setting had success. In the revision arm, it was nearly 93% of those patients who had clinical success. Here's an example of an acute type 1A endoleak that was treated at our own institution. In this lady who had a 9.5 centimeter aneurysm, a very difficult, tortuous proximal neck. After implantation of the endograft, you can see this endoleak right at this point. After a cuff was placed, anchors were placed, there was no endoleak on the conclusion aortogram in the operating room. And then finally, the control, the CT angiogram done 30 days later, showed an excellent clinical result. So when we look at our own registry, and what we can identify is that only 3 patients, when they were treated with a hostile neck in the primary setting, only 3 patients had an endoleak, 1.5%. This compares very favorably to a meta-analysis that was published by Antonio just 2 years ago that identified an almost 10% stroke rate, 10% endoleak rate when the hostile necks were treated. We also consider previously, before we had an anchor, what was used. We sometimes would use a Palmaz, a balloon expandable stent in this circumstance. In this publication from 2013, identified that those patients, when they were treated with a Palmaz stent in the acute setting, they still left the operating room with an 8.5% type 1 endoleak rate. So still a potential failure in an unprotected situation on a patient who could then have aneurysm expansion, rupture, and then death. So we conclude from the early results that these anchors show excellent results as prophylaxis for late proximal seal complications, 99% success rate. We also found that the endo anchors show effectiveness in treating acute and late type 1 endoleaks. The remediation rate when they return for revision is 90% or greater. And there's a low reintervention rate in the primary arm when the patients go back. It's been less than 1%. So when we consider the overall clinical outcomes for anchors, we recognize that we look at both the Staple 2 data and also the Anchor Registry, that the anchors directly reduce complications in reintervention. It provides a definitive secondary intervention for leaks and migration, and ultimately it can also improve the EVAR viability for those underserved patients who still may require open repair. We have an additional population of patients that potentially could have EVAR with this system. Thank you. Now I will turn over to Dr. Martinson, who will give us more information about meta-analysis in this device.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. I think I'm the last speaker standing between you and exit from the room, so I will keep my remarks brief. I'm going to present today the statistical evidence that we have that the Aptus endoanchors provide substantial clinical benefit compared to EVAR procedures alone. And my remarks today will first give you the conclusions that we are driving towards in this discussion, and then an introduction to the Helifix meta-analysis, along with the methods that we use to compare EVAR with and without the Helifix endoanchors, and finally, the results and conclusions. So basically, we found, as a result of this analysis, that, we found that Helifix significantly improves clinical outcomes for a patient compared to EVAR by reducing endograft-related complications and by decreasing the rate of subsequent EVAR interventions. For those of you who are not familiar with meta-analysis, the general purpose of a meta-analysis is to take a number of studies, 2 or more studies that have presented results on similar endpoints, and to combine those results into a summary measure, summary estimate of the rate or mean that provides a lot more precision in the estimate. So you know the rate or the mean much more accurately, more precisely. What we did, because we had some challenges with the meta-analysis, the challenges were
that the Helifix results were estimated from an FDA pivotal trial, the FDA pivotal trial on which approval was based, but this was a single-arm study, so there was no head-to-head comparison with standard EVAR. Here are the studies that we included in the analysis. As you'll see on this side, there were 11 studies of EVAR-only procedures and the publication of the FDA pivotal trial results on the endo anchors. The other point that I'd like to make from this slide is that the population of patients in the endo anchor study was very, very similar to those in the EVAR-only studies. The average age was about 73 years, about 94% were male, and the average aneurysm size was about 5.5 centimeters. Here's the data that we pulled from those studies. We looked at the rate of conversion to open procedure, aneurysm mortality, all-cause mortality, ruptures, major leaks. These are leaks requiring reintervention, migration, and sac enlargement. Down here we have the rates for the endo anchors, and along here you see the rates that we pulled from the various studies. You do not have to have a rate for every endpoint from every study. Fortunately, for meta-analysis, you use what's available for each endpoint. This graphic provides a summary of the results that I just provided, that I just showed in the last table. And the reason I did this was so that you could get kind of a gestalt of how much the endo anchors improved some of these endpoints. We took the rates that we meta-analyzed and compared them using Fisher's exact test. And we found out of the 7 endpoints that we measured that 2, in fact, were highly statistically significant. Leaks requiring treatment and enlargement of the sac greater than 5 millimeters. These were each highly statistically significant, and the magnitude of the decrease was clinically important too. So here's the conclusions that we drew from the meta-analysis. That Helifix significantly improves clinical outcomes for a patient population compared to EVAR by reducing endograft-related complications. Helifix significantly reduced the endograft-related endoleaks. These were endoleaks requiring treatments, primarily type 1 endoleaks, from 12% to a little over 1%. This was at 3 years. And it also decreased the rate of subsequent EVAR interventions due to graft-related complications. And the incidence of aneurysm enlargement was reduced from about 13% to about 4%. So the rate of reintervention on those aneurysms was significantly decreased. The overall conclusions. Are you presenting?
Sure.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. We'd like to conclude just by stating a couple of things. We believe that the Aptus Helifix device is a new device. Certainly in the realm of endovascular therapy, it is new. We also believe that there are significant cost considerations that this device addresses. And I think from the data that Dr. Jordan has presented, as well as Melissa, I think we can say that there is substantial clinical improvement with this particular device. Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have questions for anyone on the speaker panel? Please step up to the microphone.
I have a comment. I'm Carlo DeLomo, a vascular surgeon with a 10-member group in Flint, Michigan. In our experience, the Aptus endovascular anchor offers a substantial clinical improvement to the public because it makes available a less invasive endovascular repair of an abdominal aortic aneurysm to an increased number of individuals. You've been presented data substantiating the benefits of this new technology in hostile aortic necks. But we have to remember that there's also, in the treatment of abdominal aortic aneurysms, other hostile surgical conditions, such as hostile abdomens from multiple procedures, obesity, and the aged, which lead to increased complications with standard open operative approaches, and which, as surgeons, we would preferably prefer to avoid. Being able to utilize the endo-anchor in the short hostile aortic neck in patients allows the surgeon to gain a secure fixation of the aortic endograft while at the same time avoiding open procedures in these hostile, highly morbid conditions. This is a priceless benefit in the care of the patient. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Doctor. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience?
Well, first a question and then a comment for Dr. Jordan. For these devices, as far as the studies that and the information that you have you seen a difference between the different devices as far as the results with the endo anchors?
I would say that we're having continued analysis in the core laboratory, and we do not have a definite difference between the endograft types at this time.
Okay. Very much like Dr. Dalomo has mentioned, in our experience and after participating in many of these trials over the years, as the Chief of Vascular Surgery at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, we found, just like the suggestions from these trials, that the use of these devices really have helped us in patients that we've had secondary or even tertiary interventions to try to avoid them and make them a lot safer in patients that we have a lot of difficulty to be able to use endovascular devices and patients that are really not candidates for open repair. And this would be a huge benefit for our patient population. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other? Yes. Please step up to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Bart Moose, and I'm the Clinical Director of Vascular Surgery at Yale University. And I felt it was important for me to make the trip down here to make this comment. Initially, I have a large aortic practice. I've saved several people's lives with this device. And this device is the only device that allowed me to do that. And currently, because of the reimbursement, and the importance of this meeting is why I'm here, I am now unable to get that device because the hospital will not supply it because it's not reimbursed. And so I'd just like to make a comment and stress the importance of the outcome of this meeting to the care of our patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes.
If I can make a comment, I'm Mike Tuchek. I'm a cardiac surgeon at Loyola University in Chicago, and our practice includes 34 hospitals in 3 states, and I do a lot of thoracic stent graft trials. Many of these hospitals we practice at, as you just heard, don't allow us to use the aptostapling device because of prohibitive costs. Thoracic aneurysms, which you saw high up in the chest, are in areas just outside of the heart where there's much higher forces, more angulation, and more challenging anatomies than AAA. Thoracic stent grafts are currently the standard of care for therapy and our first choice, but treatment of short necks, neck dilation, and endoleaks is all but non-existent except for open surgery. Open surgery is far more risky than opening up the abdomen, and it includes a 5 to 20% chance of being permanently paralyzed or being a paraplegic. In other words, they never walk again despite a perfect operation. Most patients refuse surgery for that reason and choose death or rupture, and I think that's unacceptable. The aptostapling device is an effective non-surgical treatment we can offer these patients, and with the device we give them a non-surgical treatment option. In fact, it's the only option these patients have with these kinds of problems. I implore you to improve the add-on reimbursement for this aptostapling device to give our patients real treatment options. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Any others? Yes, Doctor.
I know our time is short. My name is Dr. David Deaton. I was most recently Chief of Vascular Surgery at Georgetown, and I have worked with this technology for 10 years. I think that, as all these speakers have emphasized, I'd like to emphasize that this technology is, while it's in a new technology session, and it is a new technology, fundamentally it simply represents our ability to offer the most basic aspect of all vascular reconstruction. That's just an interrupted suture via a catheter-based delivery. So it's both old, but also very, very new, but also very old and very fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Any others? Question, comments? Are there any on the phones? Please pound 5 if you have a question to unmute your phone. If not, Thank you very much. And I have some, thank you, doctors. And I have some closing remarks. Oh, laptop. Somebody's laptop. I'll take it. Thanks. So I want to thank all the speakers for their presentations. We appreciate everyone traveling near and far, for the people viewing via live stream, and for people listening over the phones. We are asking for the public's feedback via the email box newtech@cms.hhs.gov regarding the live stream viewing technology added this year. If the feedback is favorable, next year's New Technology Town Hall meeting may be a total virtual meeting. One more reminder, the deadline for any written comments is close of business Wednesday, March 5, 2014, which are to address the substantial clinical improvement of the applicants this year. Thanks again, everyone. That concludes the New Tech Town Hall. Thank you.